I will talk a bit about FASD, but I really want to talk about relationship and the title of this notion, which is building communities. And it says through an Indigenous lens, which is an oxymoron for me in some respects. I think that what we're talking about is respect. And the whole notion of the Latin word of respect is to look again, right? To again see something, to consider it. And we have an opportunity as Indigenous people in this country, and as those of you whose roots extend elsewhere in the world. And some of you are Indigenous in your own places. As a matter of fact, you all are. It's just some of you have had further colonization efforts over thousands of years as opposed to hundreds of years. And the opportunity for us to heal, to reconcile, to create a new process moving forward where we build on our strengths has been given to us in the form of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and more importantly, in the form of a post-TRC world. And I thought in the work that you do, and the fact that you have made space for us, and that you've made space inside what you do for us, should be acknowledged. In some respects, Sharon Richards and Mary and others who were part of the founding of this process, found all kinds of ways, including through Kim Yawaski, to sort of bring me here and get me attracted. And they roll me out every few years, I guess, so you're not too bored, to give me time for a speech in the hopes that I will fire you up. Or if nothing else, confuse you about, really did you deserve that outstanding on your performance appraisal or not? And so there is some space for conversation, and you've demonstrated it, and clearly Cheryl and the people who've taken it over have continued that space, and we're grateful. But there's a real opportunity for us now to create systemic change in this country. So the work that you do at communities are going to create community change. Every day, one foot in front of the other, the hard work you do, focusing on an issue, will create change in your community, and you're to be commended. But in the end, we need systemic change. We need the change of policies, of procedures, of legislation, of historical allocation models, of quid bloody fighting over money, the ways that there are to divide and conquer, and we need to establish a new relationship. And I thought that maybe I could spend a few minutes until Angel waves at me, and then I'll talk about FASD. So if you're going to fall asleep after lunch, now would be the time, so you come back in just before I finish. So I want to tell you that you're going to hear words in Truth and Reconciliation about things like the societal changes, and the buzz phrase that's going around is the whole of government. And I think as people who live in Canada, we're going to feel comfortable that at least this government that was elected federally has done something about Indigenous issues. The fact of the matter is, as a country, we're broke. We're all broke. It's not just us living in poverty anymore. You all have mortgaged not only your children's future, you mortgage your grandchildren's future, you mortgage your great-grandchildren's future, right? Maybe you now understand what 7 generations of being poor is going to be like. And what I worry about in that context is that there are historical issues that have built up over a long period of time that aren't just going to take a budget with a little bit in it to change it. So what we need is not just a whole of government, and I'll pick on the province in a few minutes as well. It's a whole of society that needs to change. People in this country were shocked at the degree of which the school system, particularly the residential school system, was intended to deprogram us, only to reprogram us in a mold that we wouldn't, and didn't want to, and shouldn't fit. The Indigenous peoples of this country's truths come from our relationship with the natural world and the spirit world, not made up pieces of paper where we interpret the Creator's law and say, here's statute. We will find no justice in pursuing court. It's statute law. Men of European descent made most of them up. So 50% of the population didn't have any say right off the bat, and certainly neither did we, since we weren't citizens of the country until post-1961. We continue in an Indian Act to be treated as though we're dependents of the Crown. And we didn't bring any of those things to the relationship. One of my traditional teachers said, well, first I'll tell you this, right? How many people in the room are treaty people? Everybody put your hand up. How many people in the room are treaty people? Put your hand up. If you came to this country, if you live in this country, we didn't make these bloody treaties with ourselves. If we did, we'd be better. Who did we make them with? With you. And if you came to this country after treaties were made, you agreed to a citizenship code where you were going to honor those treaties. We are all treaty people. We, on the other hand, never gave you a liquor to sign the treaty. We didn't break the treaty. We, on the other hand, don't take your kids away. We didn't break the treaty. We, on the other hand, don't have a bunch of jails. We didn't break the treaty. We honor the water, the land, and our relationship with you. Nobody's been told, go home. We didn't break the treaty. So we have this opportunity for a new relationship. We have a new opportunity in negotiating a new proclamation from the time when we were equal. When the group who came from Europe and other places in the world were dependent on us to make it. Well, now we're dependent on you to make it. And you've got to think about that role, and you have to say, well, what things change? What do they have to change? So now we're in another process where we're going to deprogram and reprogram. And those of you who work in this very, very sensitive field know that's not an instant process. We can't just release a report and it's done. These are lifelong relationships, right? Everybody has to be engaged. That it really does take a village, right? Clinton wrote the book and got the royalties, but we always knew it to be a truth. There are so many of our truths that are bothered or that are borrowed. I don't know why we don't trademark. We just give things freely. Sitting in a circle, right? That's a whole therapy field now, eh? Let's sit in a circle, right? Peer support, peer mentoring, eh? Big billion-dollar industry. They write books about self-help and, just talking to somebody who's walked your life, eh? Has lived experience, right? It's a technical thing, okay? And now you got to have a bloody certificate to do it. Yet your granny did it over the kitchen table. I don't care who your granny was, right? She had all kinds of advice for everybody. Mine did. And I met some of yours, so did they. So what's old is new again. And the issue of creating human relationships that respect a natural world and powers, however you see them, spirits bigger than you, is in vogue. But it's an opportunity to begin to speak and teach the truth again. That might be called by some of you Aboriginal cultural competency. The Premier of this province, who has 3 Cree First Nation grandchildren, wants to make sure that those 2 little girls' and little boys' future is different than what she is currently governing. And so everybody involved in the civil service and the Crown agencies and other places will get Aboriginal cultural competency. We believe that training, that notion of being competent, requires you to have a relationship, requires you not just to understand basic things about who the people are or treaties, but actually about how we operate and what works with us. And I can tell you, given the statistics, which I won't go through today, because I'm already halfway through. By the way, these are still just my introductory remarks. I'm going to get in the meat of it, okay? So you'll have to seatbelt yourself in at the end. But we need to begin to move in different directions. And the institutions that you work for, and the nonprofits that you have created, and the civil engagement processes and governments need to change. We're not the only one that needs to change in this relationship. And so I started out with recognizing that you've made some space for us. I'm going to ask you, through the course of implementing and living in a post-truth and reconciliation world, to do more than make a little bit of space. And I ask you to learn to trust us. And you can't trust us if you don't have a relationship. I'm going to ask you to learn to be friends with us and not the power dynamics that exist. Because friends means everyone is at the same level, not higher or lower. I'm going to ask you to share with us. And that means power and money. And I'm going to ask you to respect the relationships that existed and to build them into contemporary models where we'll see an improvement in all of our situations. It doesn't help you mortgaging your children's future. It doesn't help us being the driving force in a number of communities of all of the incredibly high-cost interventions that are not helpful. Right? Police, cops, courts, emergency room, child welfare, addictions, right? You see what I mean? We can do a better job. We all can, and it's going to take all of us. And the Truth and Reconciliation tried to talk about that. And it asked people, and it made two very specific recommendations with respect to FASD, which I told you I'll talk about FASD as we're going along. So part of the issue for us is that we have learned the ways of the colonizer. We do that ourselves to ourselves. We don't need external people to do it anymore. We do it in a variety of ways. We're First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. We live on territory, we live in urban. We're male and female. We experience violence, you see? We do it. And the whole system maintains that by making us fight over money, but it also maintains it by pitting us against each other in program design. So you can't actually meet the needs in your community because you got this box you have to fit into. And if you fit in the box, your community loses trust and faith with you because it's not what they need. But if you don't take what's there, you see what happens. And so we have internal pressures, and we also have external pressures. So one of the big things you're going to have to share with us is human resources. Not yours, by the way. And we need you to hire more than one of us at a time, because it's awful lonely being the only scone at your party. It's very difficult to walk into a room, isn't it? I have friends in here. I have a Grand Chief friend in here. Sometimes we walk into a room and we're the only one, and you're all looking at us saying, tell us. Well, you know what? We can't tell you. We can share our experience. We can encourage you to do certain things, but we all are not the same. So if you're looking for sameness in the approach and in the relationship, you need to examine that. You can't do a single thing that will work with us. Just like what works in downtown Toronto doesn't work in downtown Kenora. Because after you find downtown Kenora, and there's a big sign to tell you you're downtown Kenora. I know this to be true. There's no big sign that tells you you're downtown Toronto. But look out there and you know. If you're not in the middle of condo development, you're not downtown. So the issue for us is we can't answer all your questions because you have them today. It took us a long time to arrive where we have arrived. And just because you know somebody who's great, I call this my favorite First Nation syndrome, right? I don't mind if I'm your favorite First Nations person. But I have a job to do, so that's rare. So what happens is you know one and you say, okay, I know, I have a relationship. And we are going to have a conversation about what are the standards and norms for us. And they're going to differ. And they should differ, because look how many agencies and organizations you create. And yet, we're just one, maybe, if we're lucky, right? A service provider or a political representative or whatever. There continue to be issues in our community despite good work being done by leadership with respect to gender. In this country, Indigenous women and Indigenous men, but Indigenous women disproportionately, seem to go missing and are murdered. And we live in a country who purports to be in the top 10 with respect to human rights. What is it we do? And I'm asking all of you to do it. I'm not asking you to just think somebody's going to take care of that. Where are the letters? Where's the outrage? Do you come to our marches? Were you in Kenora joining in looking for that young woman? Right? It's about action. It's not just about talking it and framing it and saying we have a protocol and let's put it on the wall. We have to change implementation issues. Just because you've always done it that way, I want to talk about your structure for a minute, doesn't mean it's the right way. It just means you've always done it that way. If I ask you, are you satisfied with the way that FASD is being addressed in schools, by police, by affordable housing, by Ontario Disability Support, can you all look me in the eye and say, oh yeah, we're happy? You're an action-oriented group because you're dissatisfied. You have some best practices and you want to share them. But you want change. And you want change that's supportive and representative of your community experience, and that people are valued and have strengths to add to the relationship. Unless I misunderstand you. Okay? Well, we want that as well. So let me tell you a few things I think that you can do. So one of the things I didn't do, which is a perfect example, is I did not acknowledge the traditional territories that we're on, who belonged to a number of people. If you go all the way back to the Neutrals, to the Wyandot people, to the Mississaugas of New Credit, to both the Seneca and the Mohawks. It was a treaty covered a long time ago by something called one bowl and one spoon. That's how close our relationship was. That we weren't going to fight over food, and we weren't going to say, I don't want your cooties. We're going to eat out of it. It was very important, that imagery. And I should do that. The Premier, on her own, began it, and it's caught on, and you almost never go anywhere. And I don't know, maybe you did that at the beginning of your opening, and that's great if you did. But you all need to do that, and you need to take that moment in time to understand on whose territory you're on. And we can hide, and you can be a nationalist Canadian all you want. I'm not saying don't do that. But Canada, right, was established on the basis of hundreds of nations that were here. And if you just learn that much and you do that much, Imagine how that would change the tone of the board of directors of every child and family service agency in the province if they stopped for a minute and offered their thanks to the Indigenous people, as opposed to the thanks that, based on a caseload, we're contributing to them. There was an actual acknowledgement. Ryerson University, bless them, does it. They've embodied it into the code of their student council and other things, and they do it. They do a whole process about it. And, you know, we have titles. We're up here, and we're growing up in theory, or we're growing older, maybe not up. And we should be able to do that. And that very simple act would begin to create a consciousness. Because people are then going to ask you, well, what's that about? And you have to have that much more knowledge to talk about it. So that's a very simple thing you could do. The TRC, in a series of recommendations, talks about space. And when I use the word space, I'm not just talking about physicality. I'm talking about the ability to have a conversation, the ability to have conversations without agendas and ends to them, because they talk about a relationship and the relationship doesn't exist. And that we have to role model that relationship, which means sometimes you're going to be uncomfortable. Okay? But you have to get over your guilt too. Okay? Nobody's ever saying forget all this stuff. We're saying let's deal with it and move on. And we're going to have some times where we're not comfortable with each other. But again, let's talk about FASD and ask ourselves, how often do we create situations where people aren't comfortable in what's going on or around? Creating space is also going to talk about not just restructuring the discussions, but you have a tendency to invite us, you expect us to bring the answers, you expect us to be happy that you've made the space for us, but it's not about expectations, it's about respect. And so what are you contributing to that? Are you saying, we need to hire First Nations Métis Inuit people to have First Nations Métis Inuit conversations? That we need training about it. We need to understand. If I ask you and you could, had a little thing where you could press a button, people don't even know how to speak, how to call us. And it's sometimes the first question I'm asked in more private meetings, how do you prefer to be referred to? And my answer is usually, if you're talking about me personally, I quite like Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces. If you're asking me as an individual and collectively, then one, we can tell you. If you know the nation, then it makes sense that you would have that conversation. But ask. Some people don't like to be called, for instance, Aboriginal. So we know we didn't like Indian, right? The earlier Trudeau and Chrétien made that nasty, right, in the white paper policy, okay? It was incorrect in the beginning, remember? I didn't mind it if it was really Latin, right? Indeo, right? God's likeness, that was okay. Right? But then they put the and on it. They left the O off and they put the AN. So anyway, we didn't like that. We certainly have not liked Aboriginal. We're moving to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, but there are some issues with respect to that in terms of nations are collections of individual communities, but now all the individual communities are called that. The Métis are struggling with their definitions in court, and the Inuit are quite clear. And now the word Indigenous has come up in the context usually of UN declaration issues and the connectedness to land, original people. But you should have a conversation with the people you work with about what do they prefer to be called, as this is evolutionary. But don't be shy. If you're shy, you don't ask, you won't know. And you'll always be held back by that. So it is important that you do that. And it's the other issue I want to talk to you about this space is in space, in my notion of space, it also talks about money. So it's not just a physicality, but you're experts at finding ways, and I looked at the Kenora Patrician. I know their project from work that we have done in creating our own strategy and in trying to support them. We have a secondary school there as well, and part of the relationship is sometimes you need quiet space, right? You need less sort of distractions. You need whatever. In our case, we were able, in this province, for instance, a number of years ago, to change legislation and permit, right, not with open oxygen or where people have huge health issues, but medicines to be burned or to be put outside or whatever. So those are kinds of things that you have to do. Not everybody smudges, you know that? So just because you got a shell and you whip out some sage, some people are going to look at you and say, well, what are you doing? Right? And you're going to say, oh, well, this is what I was taught. Buy your favorite whoever. See what I mean? Understand where you're dealing with. But in that relationship of space, we have to talk about money. So one thing is, don't always meet in your office. Why do we always got to come? I don't mind these ballrooms. I mean, the chandeliers alone are worth looking at. But sometimes you got to come to where we live, right? Because we do it a little differently. Yesterday, I had a retired deputy minister tell a story of when we were having our first consultations with the establishment of the Ontario Women's Directorate. And she came to our space, and we did a lovely traditional opening, and it was amazing. And at the end of the meeting, the fact that we all stayed together to have this conversation, this was in the 70s, so they were wilder times. You know, we used to call each other bitches and mean it. And we said, okay, you're going to host the next one. We're at your place. Okay, they say. So she tells the story about, so, you know, their government. So they put a committee together. The committee is going to figure out how to do the opening and the meeting with, you know, these First Nations, primarily women who are coming to this meeting. Weeks go by. They're looking at all their traditions, and they say, we don't have a tradition for this. We don't know what to do. And they have to come and tell her. So she has to call me on the phone, and she goes, you know what? Apparently, our committee can't figure out how to pray for you. I said, that's tough. She said, it is. So when you come, will you do the opening and will you do the prayer? And we were gracious and said, yes. We wanted money from them. I want to tell you why we were being so nice. So I said, yeah, we will. And we did. And I did a long prayer. And I did a long prayer because I could use all these examples of things that if I were in their moccasins, I would do. And thank the spirits at the end. And I sat down. And she said, and I realized I was the chair. And she goes, there was stunned silence. And then finally somebody said, okay, well, let's start the meeting. Right? And we went. But you gotta create all kinds of space, and some of that means, so now OWD has Aboriginal women who work for them, who are specialists, who know how to consult, who can train other people, and I want to encourage you to do some of that. I don't want to encourage you to steal our best and brightest. If you're our best and brightest and you're in this room, stay there. You know, but unless, if we're always seen as outside, we will always be outside. And there has to be some common space that you don't own, that we don't own, where we meet. And there are going to need to be people who facilitate those discussions and interpret for both of us. Because I don't always understand you either. So culture absolutely has to be at the basis of what we're doing. We have a different identity, and it has been the removal of our identity through this systemic deprogramming of us, of saying it wasn't valuable, that we shouldn't do it. And that means that sometimes we have to learn to do it. So you invite people, maybe, who are knowledge keepers, and they can tell you, but they can't always frame it, because you know what? We have a whole bunch of healing that we have to do. And there's no such thing as a traditional knowledge keeper school. You know, it takes a long time, and like you're aware, lived experience. But it is absolutely important, and it is a way for us to celebrate. What if we actually celebrated things together? What if National Aboriginal Day wasn't June 21st, when everybody's out of school and starting to go wherever? Right? I was on a TV panel a couple weeks ago, or a month or so ago, and I absolutely, am envious of Black History Month. I am. We got a day, and we have so many units of curriculum, right? So many a year. I want the whole damn month. I'm there for you. Let's just figure out when. And it can't be June. And it can't be Christmas, because that makes no sense to us, okay? So, but culture has to be part of this. And every institution, and maybe you're not working for them. Maybe you're sitting here and you have a volunteer life where you sit on a board. I'm talking about every agency in this country has to look at how it does business, how it interacts with our community post-TRC. And don't get overwhelmed by the task, because sometimes you only have a board of 8 or 10 people and a staff of 10. It's not like 20 of you can't sit down and have a conversation about doing things differently. And if you all did it, we would create not just community change, the systemic change that the Commission talks about and that I'm absolutely committed to. There are lots of ways that you can support this discussion, yet you're silent so many times. You're the silent majority. We think you agree. Every once in a while, one of you writes a letter to the editor, but where's the other stuff? If all we do is write, right? Can you all write? I know you can't all read, because, I'm accused of it all the time. I interpret things. I just read what I want. It's that simple, right? But where is that, even just that? Right? Demonstrations became popular again for us. They were really popular in the 1970s. I'm convinced one of the reasons we did so many demonstrations in the 1970s is we were all broke and we didn't have long distance. And if you occupied a government office, you had a free phone line all night, talk to your family. Right? You got to sit, in the regional director of INAC's chair and, do things that would settle them later if they knew about it. So we kind of don't do all of that civil comments, but there are things, as I said, that we can do. When you're sitting in a room and they're designing policies and procedures, you should ask if the Aboriginal community, the First Nations, Métis, Inuit community, the Indigenous community has their own process. You could do that simple. That simple issue of shifting power is say to the government, we're not going to talk about everybody here. We recognize there's a different requirement. Doesn't hurt you. You can focus on what you know well. You could ask us, and we were asked, by the way, with respect to the parliamentary assistant. We were asked, and I was pleased that we were able to respond. We were able to share what we were putting forward, what we advanced, because we had had some early meetings, because we had to convince them that this wasn't a predisposed genetic issue for us, and talk about some principles about it. So you ask, but again, in all of these other fields, we're not always asked. So I know you're not going to be in the 5 minutes, but let me talk about some FASD specific things before I wrap this up. So I really want you to hear that there's a monumental time right now, that there's the perfect storm coming. A federal government who might listen, and there might be resources. A provincial government who is intent on creating different relationships with the Indigenous community. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission which has woken up the beast as we begin to see the issues of addictions, of mental health, of relationships, of our parenting, skills that were never transferred to us, of our own internalization of some of the behaviors. We too want to heal. Changes are occurring in education, in curriculum. We're looking at different kinds of approach. Jails want less people in jail. Child welfare wants less people in formalized child welfare. We want family to also be part of reconciliation. We all want that. We want fathers, particularly young fathers, to see their children. We want children to be safe when they're doing that, but we want fathers to come back. We don't just want baby daddies and bio contributions. We want children to be able to see that. Women are raising boys, and we wonder about the degree of violence, and we need to talk about those things. But in terms of FASD, there was really a call for the provincial government. But if you read about the mental health issues in terms of truth and reconciliation, you'll see a call for looking at FASD dramatically, perhaps, or maybe not dramatic to you differently. So by the way, this is my speech, and as you can tell, I've really been going from these notes, so I apologize to what I ask Angel to write for me. So the Commission in Recommendation 33 and 34 talks about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder specifically, and it calls upon the federal government, provincial government, and territorial governments to recognize as a high priority the needs to address, and more importantly, perhaps prevent FASD, and to develop in collaboration with Aboriginal people FASD preventative programs that can be delivered in a culturally appropriate manner. So I told you, in a post-Truth and Reconciliation world, there are certain priorities that we have to have. And interestingly enough, they happen to be contained in here. I'm going to talk about changing the landscape, looking at prevention. It's not that we're not supporting people as they go through their experiences, and we have to do that in a culturally appropriate manner. And I notice in many places where I go, these little tiny teepees, I see them around classrooms for children who get overstimulated and too much can go. And I just want you to know they're little teepees. Okay, that's all. Okay? They're not little log cabins, right? They're not. So maybe you want to think about that. The other thing that the Commission called upon Canada, the provinces, and the territories was to undertake reforms to the criminal justice system to better address the needs of offenders with FASD. And they gave you 4 things to do here. That criminalization of poverty, criminalization of race in this country, criminalization of FASD, criminalization of mental health and addictions-related processes as opposed to healing and health are not the way to go. That we know people are further victimized in there. We know that they don't get help. We know they kind of don't get the kinds of supports they need, and we need to do something about it collectively. And in our community, we're talking about increased community resources and powers for the courts to make sure that it's diagnosed and appropriate community supports are in place. I don't know if you know, but there was a judge, she's currently the Ombudsman for Children in British Columbia, Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, who was a presiding judge in Saskatchewan, and she would order FASD, and she had more judicial inquiries, so Crowns in particular, making complaints about her so other judges would review her behavior, because they felt that she was being a social worker on the bench. And I think we need more social workers on the bench. I don't know. So They want to have statutory exemptions from the mandatory minimum sentences. You know, if you need some help externally in terms of boundaries and setting those, then you need that help, and we should provide that help. We shouldn't just lock you up. That community correctional and parole resources provide them to maximize their ability with FASD people to live in the community. And to adopt an appropriate evaluation mechanism to ensure there's effective programs. One of the things we haven't been doing is there is a notion that we talked about for the last day or two. It's a concept that we ask the disempowered for things that we would never ask the empowered. Right? So we ask the disempowered for things that we would never ask of the empowered. The car plants need bailouts from the government. They don't have to do a needs assessment. They don't have to do community mapping. They don't have to have measurable performance outcomes. Or what's the new thing? It's got some new initials that bothers me. The minute we catch them, they change them, eh? You know that jargon? Do you understand what I'm talking about? Yet organizations like yours and mine, oh, we got to have a needs assessment. We got to prove it. I got to talk about the bang for the buck. The system is fundamentally, so we're working with people who don't have all the power in the relationship, right? And we got to do this host of things. And I promise you, for $500 million, the car plants didn't have to submit quarterly reports and an annual meeting. An annual report. They were meeting their targets, and how? And that's all of us. That's all of our tax money at work. Okay? And I don't care if the book is an orange book or a blue book or a red book. There's a book. And it has taken away the ability for us to actually, because we're experts in the field, whether we're credentialed or not isn't it. And everyone doesn't matter what your issue is. If you have a lived experience, you have a lived experience. Whether it's a lived experience because the person walks beside you, whether it's internalized. You know, my sister delivered her babies, you know, until her third one, she quit at 5 with gestational diabetes, but with a traditional midwife. We understand it. I also understand what a licensed midwife is. And I also understand that there are old women on trap lines in Northern Ontario who just do it and don't call themselves a midwife. And I understand that doctors get anywhere from $24,000 to $80,000 more dollars than those women get for those babies, right? So it can apply in many, many fields. It's not just FASD. And so the issue is, why are we asking people who actually know, who shouldn't have to prove it? Why don't we make it easier for you to do your job so you can do more of your job and less of the bureaucracy? Right? I get that I'm an Indigenous bureaucrat. Hell, I'm so fiscally responsible I scare them when I walk in. But I could do a lot more work if I wasn't feeding the fire. And so if the work that you do, and you believe, is legitimate work, and you're the experts because you do it, because you walk in those moccasins every day, why don't we make the walk easier for you? Why are we making it harder for you? And I don't understand that. I understand, if you're here from a Children's Aid Society, you can, hate me at the end if you like. I'm fine, because I don't like Children's Aid Societies. So it's even. The issue for me is that they're not accountable for billions of dollars. We don't know what the bang for the buck really is for all those kids in care. We don't know. The only thing that we're afraid of is the 1 or 2 times we make a mistake. But you make a mistake, 5 or 10 times are in the paper a year? For tens of thousands of kids? There has to be some notion that there is some expertise, that science is always not the answer, that making space for people, that making time, that building relationships and frankly, doing things differently and making mistakes so that we can learn from them. The time is now. If we don't take this opportunity that's provided for us, we are not going to do things better. You are going to have yet another generation of First Nations, of Métis, of Inuit children from communities and in urban areas who don't have the quality of life that they deserve. Not just that we desire for them, that they deserve. So you have to change, but it's every one of you in this room has a little bit of behavior, a little bit of positive spin, and when we heap it all together, it will make us shiny again, and it will create the change. And we will have less FASD in the future, because we'll have families who are healthy, who have their identity, who don't have to feel like they're second class, and who have friends and advocates who will hold them up as a model for all to see. Thank you for listening. Donette.